The Aurelia Museum of Art and History is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe include the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. We respect and observe the long and enduring presence of Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit on this land. Their teachings and stewardship, culture, and way of life have shaped our city's unique identity.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our talk for this evening. And thank you for your ongoing support for the OMAH-History Speaker Series. I'm Hannah Arndt, the History Programming Coordinator here at OMAH. I'm excited to announce this is our last talk before our annual summer hiatus. And if anyone listened to Amanda's interview this morning on CBC, this is a steamy lecture fitting for the current weather we're having. A quick thank you to the OMAH History Committee for their work behind the scenes, and to Deanne McCullum from Rogers for recording our history speakers for viewing on Rogers Cable. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome Amanda Marino, the Experience Development Officer at the Leacock Museum. She's presenting a Leacock Love Story, a captivating talk exploring the women in Stephen Leacock's life, focusing on his wife, Beatrix Hamilton Leacock, and their beautiful love story. Amanda Marino is an emerging museum professional who specializes in early 20th century Canadian social history. As Experience Development Officer at the Leacock Museum, she oversees the museum's historical collection, exhibits, and tours. Over to you, Amanda.
Hi there. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Perfect. Thank you so much for that introduction. I appreciate it. I'm very excited to be sharing this topic with all of you today, and thank you to the Aurelia Museum of Art and History for this opportunity. As Hannah said, my name is Amanda Marino. I'm the Experience Development Officer at the museum. I care for the artifacts and oversee the creation of exhibits at the Leacock Museum. This talk is based on an exhibit that we put forward in 2023 and a subsequent Valentine's Day themed guided tour we created based on that story. So let's get started on a Leacock love story. Throughout this talk, I hope to introduce you to some other members of the Leacock family, in particular the women. Stephen Leacock is a success, he's the writer, but there was a lot that happened behind the scenes that is extremely interesting. And for me, especially, the social history in this way is the most fun to share. So though this talk is mostly about the love story, there are other members of the family that come into play throughout and really impact it and the lives of these two individuals as a whole. So this is the summer home of famous Canadian humorist and economist Stephen Leacock. This home was built in 1928 and is in the arts and crafts style. It sits on 9.5 acres of land in Aurelia, Ontario, but when Leacock owned it, it was actually 33 acres of property. But now it's a designated heritage site and museum operated by the city of Aurelia. There are 19 rooms within the building, 9 fireplaces, more than 5 gardens on the property, a wooded lot, original limestone pathways, the Swanmar Hall building, which now houses Fair Restaurant, and if you haven't been, you should go. It's delicious, and the historic Leacock Boathouse replica. All of the buildings are accessible to the guests, including the boathouse. As of last year, when we opened the new exhibit inside, we run guided tours to the boathouse daily from Wednesday to Sunday. We are open 10 to 4 p.m. and our guided tours are at 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. daily. If you have visited before, you would know that the museum is a waterfront property and there's a gorgeous view there. The wildlife at the museum is also incredible, as you can see from these photographs. All of the gardens are typical of the time that the Leacocks would have lived on the land. And yes, we do have 5 swans that like to swim together almost daily in the spring and summer. Now, onto the love story characters. We are going to start by talking about Stephen himself. Stephen Butler Leacock was known as the grandfather of Canadian humor. He was a very well-received humorist, author during his time, and he was also a respected political scientist and economist. During the early 1900s, he was actually the most well-known humorist in the English-speaking world. After earning his degrees, he began teaching at McGill University in political science and political economy, and then eventually began to write humorous articles that he published in periodicals. His first piece appeared in the Toronto humor magazine Grip in 1894, and then he continued to publish humorous sketches in Canadian and American magazines throughout the 1890s. In 1910, with financial assistance from his brother George, Leacock published Literary Lapses, which was a collection of previously published writings. The volume sold extremely well, and it was followed by his most famous story, Sunshine Sketches of a Little Town, in 1912. And that was his most popular humorous novel. If you've read it and you're from Aurelia, it might sound a little bit familiar because although he denied it, it became quite well known that many of the characters were based off of real people within the town. Their names would be changed by one letter here or there. So this book was pretty relatable reflection on small town life, and it actually became a world-renowned book and printed in many different languages all over the world. But of course, behind every successful man, there is a strong woman, and this is where we introduce Beatrix Hamilton Leacock. Born in 1879, Beatrix Hamilton Leacock, or Trix, as she was nicknamed, was the loving wife of Stephen Butler Leacock. Beatrix and her family were familiar with the finer things in life. She was actually the niece of Sir Henry Pellet, who built the Toronto mansion Castle OMAH. Her mother, Mary Catherine Pellet, was a very charitable woman. She was known as Lady Santa Claus by the hospital patients she delivered gifts to every year, and this was something that she passed on to her daughter as well. Her father was Robert Hamilton, an investment broker and colonel in an army regiment. Beatrix, she was raised like many other women of her time in her social status. She had lessons, she performed charity work, and she enjoyed partaking in sports and the arts. However, Beatrix had a passion and talent for acting that inspired those around her. She was often described as beautiful, strong, tall, and striking. And though participation in singing lessons and acting lessons was common for someone of her socioeconomic status, she actually shocked her friends and family by continuing to study acting professionally. Though this may have been a dream for some women at the time, or many women, very few actually took the leap to pursue such a career. Her studies took her all the way to Boston and New York, and she eventually made her way to the Broadway stage, where she appeared with famous actress Maude Adams. You see Maude Adams there in the right-hand corner. She was a very successful American actress who performed in many J.M. Barrie plays. She was best known for playing Peter Pan in the 1905 Broadway production of it. She was paid over $1 million a year, making her the highest paid theater actress of her day. So pretty impressive, Beatrix. I love this photograph of young Stephen. He just looks so different than the pictures that you see of him when he's older, without his dark hair and his mustache. A young Stephen Leacock was often described as boyish and unkempt, in a careless way with tousled sandy hair. Stephen was often described as a ladies' man by his friends due to his popularity among his female classmates. However, he only had one known romance before meeting Beatrix, which he wrote about in some of his short stories. Stephen was actually one of 11 children, and he was born in Swanmere, England. He and his family moved to a 100-acre farm near Sutton, Ontario, when he was only 7 years old. And when he was a child, he and his family loved to be near the water, and he spent much of his time sailing and swimming and spending as much time by the water that he could. This was something he continued into his adulthood and on what he called Old Brewery Bay, which was the property in Orillia. His mother, Agnes Emma Leacock, was a very important part of his life and was a huge influence on him. This is a childhood photo of Stephen Leacock's mother, Agnes. Agnes was a force to be reckoned with. Agnes's life tells the tale of a strong, independent woman with a very interesting backstory. Born on January 4th, 1845, to Reverend Stephen Butler and Caroline Linton Palmer in Hampshire, Agnes lived an upper-class lifestyle. However, unfortunately, her mother died when she was only 5 years old, and her father died 6 years later. This classified Agnes as an orphan by the age of only 11. Agnes was thereafter cared by both sides of her family. Agnes Emma Butler met Walter Peter Leacock when her uncle brought her to the Isle of Wight in the summer of 1866. Agnes wrote about sneaking away with Peter to go out into the water in his blue boat. Agnes was married to Peter on January 1st, 1867, at the age of 22. The wedding was kept a secret from both of their families, as it was rumored that Agnes was with child at the time of their wedding date. This meant that the wedding was only attended by 2 witnesses and the Reverend J.L. MacDonald at All Saints Church in London. When their family found out about their secret marriage, both of them were shunned from their families and homes. The couple were sent to the colonies to be farmers by Peter's father, Thomas Murdoch Leacock, as Peter showed no ambition for education or any special interests. Agnes and Peter did not have an easy time as farmers. When their crops were destroyed by an infestation of locusts, they moved back home to England and had their first son, Thomas James, on July 14th, 1867. When they returned to England, Agnes's family was still not speaking to her, which meant that she had to adjust to living in a lower social and economic position than when she first left for the colonies. Eventually, they found a place to call home in Egypt, Ontario in 1876. Stephen Leacock would later write about how he recalled his mother crying as they pulled up to their new home because her heart was broken from having to leave England. Although the Leacock family was very isolated due to where their new home was located, Agnes feared that her children would lose their manners and English customs due to the new Canadian culture. Agnes even took them out of school and attempted to homeschool them to ensure that they would maintain their English customs. In 1883, her 3 oldest boys, including Stephen, started attending Upper Canada College. Agnes, at this point, was supporting her children all on her own. A year after the boys went away for school, the frequently absent Peter, her husband, returned from out west after having more bad luck with his farming ventures. He began drinking and was aggressive towards Agnes and her children. Stephen recalled his father threatening them with a knife, so Leacock fought his father off to protect his family and forced him to leave the property. Later, Leacock found his father at the train station and threatened to kill him if he ever returned. Agnes was supporting all of her children on her own and was still not in contact with her family in England. Stephen stepped up due to the separation. Though he wanted to become an academic, and this was a passion of his, he instead took a course to become a high school teacher to support his mother and siblings. He did not enjoy teaching high school at all, but it paid the bills. In 1890, Agnes moved to Orillia and would remain in the Simcoe County area for the rest of her life. Agnes was loved by her children and grandchildren alike. Her children gathered around her frequently, especially in the summers in Sutton and Sybil Point. Agnes's dedication was rewarded in her later years. In Stephen's autobiography, The Boy I Left Behind Me, he wrote that she lived in a network of perpetual correspondence and casual visits from children and grandchildren. Her house a sort of family center, a number 10 Downing Street, reaching out across the continent. We currently have a mini exhibit on right now at the Leacock Museum on Leacock's mother, Agnes. It's in our library room. And we had researchers travel to Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa to read through 65 of Agnes's personal journals. We found some very interesting things in these journals, such as in almost every entry, Agnes would complain about a headache. When we researched about it further, we found out that Agnes had a serious head injury when she was a child, which caused these headaches. We also found the entry from the very day that Stephen Leacock was born, and he was born at 6 a.m. with no doctor. So if anyone is interested in learning more about her or seeing the baby cradle that Stephen was actually rocked in when he was a baby, or seeing the family album that we have of theirs, these items are all on display with personal letters written between Leacock and his mother, and the original manuscript of How We Kept Mother's Day, which is a really funny little tale that Leacock wrote in the early days of celebrating Mother's Day about a family who was well-intentioned in trying to treat their mother to a nice day, but as you can imagine, turned out having quite the opposite effect. So that's kind of a nice background on Stephen's childhood. You can see how caring for your mother and your siblings and deciding to become the man of the family would affect you later on in life. So how did Stephen and his wife Beatrix meet? Beatrix Hamilton's wealthy grandfather owned a piece of property near Orillia called Southwood. Beatrix and her mother were the most frequent visitors to Southwood, often spending entire summers there. Stephen and his family also visited Southwood often as they were close friends with the Pellets. Thank you so much to OMAH for providing these photos of Southwood. You can see how grand the building was. It was located on Lake Couchiching as well, close to Bay Street, north of the Leacock home. The land of Southwood can still be visited today, and they were rumored to have met in 1899 during a tennis match on the property. We have a quote there by David M. Legate, who says, "It was, to coin a phrase, love at first sight." They were both physically active people, and sports became an important element to their marriage. When Stephen was 30 years old, he proposed marriage to Beatrix, and she accepted. From a historian's perspective, this choice on Beatrix's part was as unconventional as the rest of her life choices had been. Stephen, a high school teacher at the time, had no family money to his name, no significant social standing, and was at the height of his salary potential. Beatrix, she was a busy woman, and so securing a wedding date proved a difficult feat. Since Beatrix was studying in New York at the time, the couple chose to be married there at the Church of Transfiguration, or what was nicknamed the Little Church around the corner. This church has ties to the arts community, and in particular, theater. Many household names were married there. Even P.G. Wodehouse's wedding was held at this church, which may have inspired his future musical Sally, which featured his song, The Little Church Around the Corner. Ever the busy couple, during the summer of 1903, Beatrix and Stephen finally took a honeymoon trip. They traveled to England, Stephen's home country, for the first time since he had emigrated at the age of 7. The couple also visited France, and after this, they settled permanently in Montreal for Stephen's teaching career. But Stephen and Beatrix wanted to create a home of their own. They rented a house in Montreal when Stephen was teaching at McGill University, but they could not wait to build on their land in Orillia. Stephen Leacock purchased this property in 1908. When he purchased it, there were remnants of an old brewery that was called Jackson's Brewery still on the property, and that is why he nicknamed the property Old Brewery Bay. So if you've ever heard that name, now you'll know where it comes from. But eventually, Stephen and his brother Charlie built a one-room shack by the water where he and Beatrix lived. Over time, the house grew as they began developing further to suit their needs. More sections were added onto the house until it took the structure kind of like a train, with one building built onto the next by side. The house suited the young couple's needs, but Beatrix felt that the space was uncomfortable for Stephen's mother, Agnes. Agnes often visited for months at a time, and eventually Beatrix convinced Stephen to build the house that currently stands on the property. You can see from these photos here that on the picture on the left was one of the original cottages down by the water, and the picture on the right is the house that currently stands on the property. That was built in 1928. Beatrix helped Stephen with his work and always supported his career. She followed him on his journeys, often accompanying him on lecture tours or moving when he changed careers. If it wasn't for Beatrix's help, Stephen's first novel, Literary Lapses, or first humorous novel, my apologies, would not have sparked Stephen's humor career. With the help of Marion Sandwell, the wife of Stephen's former student and friend, Bernard Sandwell, Beatrix compiled a collection of sketches from Stephen's files. Bernard did not agree with the decision to publish humor, as it might threaten Stephen's budding career as an economist. Stephen went ahead with publishing the collection regardless, to great success. Stephen admired his wife's wit and skill as a homemaker, calling upon her skills when he would entertain guests at their homes. Though sometimes fashionably late for their own events, or sometimes the last guests to arrive for their own events, the Leacocks loved to entertain. The Leacocks would tell stories and jokes to their guests. Friends of the couple remarked how nothing really disturbed them, even if the turkey was finished cooking hours after their guests arrived, which was a common story you can hear about the couple. Leacock was a hard worker, and so when he was spending his summer vacation at Oldbury Bay, he would wake up bright and early at 5 a.m. and walk out to the boathouse to write his stories for the first 5 hours of the morning before he began his leisure activities. This meant that Stephen kept a very strict sleep schedule, and so when he retired from his guests at exactly 10 o'clock p.m., Beatrix was left to ensure that the guests had a good time. Though often starstruck by the night's guests because Leacock had some very, very popular friends. For example, he would often host people like Rudyard Kipling, who wrote The Jungle Book, or J.M. Barrie, who wrote Peter Pan, and even people such as America's sweetheart Mary Pickford and her husband Douglas Fairbanks, and Charlie Chaplin and F. Scott Fitzgerald were fans of his. So Beatrix handled every stressful situation with smooth grace, even when being directly face-to-face with celebrities like this. Leacock was once among their fame as well. Beatrix had a calming presence on her husband. Although the Leacocks were known to be relaxed and easygoing, Stephen could sometimes lose his composure. One time, when the grocery bill was higher than expected, Stephen fired all of his kitchen staff. By the next morning, they were all hired back with pay raises due to Beatrix's coaxing. Beatrix took special care in creating clothing for her husband out of bits and pieces of fabric. Though her talent for sewing may have been lacking, Stephen the professor was known to have a disheveled look about him. I actually read something the other day that said that when he visited Beatrix in the hospital one time, people thought that he was just someone off the street and tried to kick him out of the hospital because of how he was dressed. When friends analyzed his clothing, many realized it did not fit properly. Some sections were too tight, while others were too loose. Stephen once remarked that his wife never measured him, so that might be why. Both children of single parents, Beatrix and Stephen ensured that their marriage would succeed. They supported and admired each other throughout their entire marriage. Stephen's traditional values were reflected in some of his writings, yet his respect for the women in his own life was progressive in kind. This was especially true regarding his own family members. Although, by societal standards of the time, Beatrix was expected to remain careerless once married, Stephen supported her acting passion. With a love of the stage himself, Stephen admired his wife's amateur theater experience. Additionally, Beatrix was supported in all of the sports that she did and social endeavors that she took part in before her marriage to Stephen in 1900. Researchers have stated that the Leacocks' romance was easy and felt equal. The way he had treated Beatrix continued with his favorite niece, Barbara. Barbara was the daughter of Leacock's younger sister, Carrie, and her husband. Barbara, or Ba, is often thought of as the daughter Leacock never had. Barbara was offered the chance to live with the Leacocks at their home in Montreal as a secretary, friend, and confidant in return for her tuition at McGill University, where she received her MA in English with a thesis titled Democratic Tendencies in American Poetry of the 19th Century. In the preface to her uncle's posthumous collection, Last Leaves, Barbara describes the experience as a bit like living inside a volcano. There was nothing dull or routine in life. Nonetheless, Barbara became indispensable to her uncle, typing out copies of his handwritten manuscripts, answering correspondence, and packing his bags for his frequent lecturing trips. Barbara remembered her summers at Old Brewery Bay fondly. When she married Donald Nimmo in 1937, it was here on the property that her wedding was held. Stephen spared no expense in providing a lavish reception for the couple. Following Leacock's death in 1944, Barbara continued to be involved in her uncle's legacy, for years writing forwards to his books and advising the Leacock Museum's first curator, Dr. Ralph Curry, as he set up the house to be visited by the public. In 1915, after 15 years of marriage, the Leacocks found out they would finally be expecting a child. At the time, Beatrix was 36 years old. When it was time, Beatrix and Stephen traveled from Orillia to Montreal to have the baby. It was a very difficult delivery, with both the baby and Beatrix in need of recovery afterward. But on August 19th, Stephen Lushington Leacock, or Stevie Jr., as he was nicknamed, was born. The couple couldn't be happier. They had waited so long for a child. Unfortunately, Stevie Jr. was subject to unique health issues that caused apprehension among his parents. He actually never stopped growing past the age of 10, so he always looked quite like a child. Although his mental health was, or his mental capacity was stable, and he was very, very bright, he was always treated as though he was a child, which impacted his mental health. When his niece Barbara was expecting their first child, Stephen wrote, "Whatever you get, you will wonder that you could have ever wanted the other. I spent months in dreaming of a daughter and forgot it in 1 minute, and I couldn't even understand it." The love for acting was shared among all members of the family. When Stevie Jr. was growing up, Stephen would often coordinate plays on their land. The neighbors would come together to learn lines, design costumes, and create posters. In 1924, the usually energetic Beatrix found herself subject to constant fatigue. Over the next year, Beatrix's health worsened, though her family was not worried enough to seek medical aid. Instead, Stephen took matters into his own hands and arranged a trip to sunny Nassau, Bahamas. In 1925, the family took their usual trip to Orillia for the summer months. Eventually, Beatrix began to lose weight. When she did seek out a doctor in the company of her close friend, Miss H.T. Shaw, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. At the time, her condition was attributed to a severe injury from a rogue golf ball during the summer of 1924. Beatrix underwent an unsuccessful procedure, and her illness was identified as terminal. Distraught, Stephen sprang to action to find Beatrix the best medical aid he could seek. With the help of his friend Sir Edward Beatty, president of the Canadian Pacific Railway and Chancellor of McGill, the Leacocks took a last-minute ship to England so that Beatrix could undergo an experimental lead treatment for cancer performed by Dr. Blair Bell, which we know now wouldn't have helped. Although Beatrix's chances of surviving the treatment looked bleak, Stephen remained ever so hopeful, and he even had plans to take Beatrix on a trip to the Riviera after her recovery and had her dresses packed for the journey. Unfortunately, Beatrix never made it to the Riviera as she was not strong enough to undergo the treatment. Stephen and Beatrix had been married for 25 years when on December 14th, 1925, at the age of 46, Beatrix Hamilton Leacock passed away. She left behind a distraught husband and a 10-year-old son. She passed away while in England, so Leacock arranged to have her body cremated and returned to Canada. Her funeral took place the day after Stephen's 55th birthday. She was buried in St. James Cemetery in Toronto, though Stephen planned to move her ashes to his family plot in St. George's Church in Sutton. This change never came to fruition. A family friend remarked, "When Trix died, a little bit of Stephen died too." When Beatrix passed away, word spread to Stephen's friends and family. He received many letters and telegrams expressing loved ones' sympathy. Among many of the messages was a telegram from Sir Arthur Currie, the first and only Canadian commander of the Canadian Corps during World War I, who was at one point one of Stephen's many students. Stephen could not return to his house here in Orillia for 2 years after Beatrix's passing. The fervor that Stephen displayed in trying to cure his wife remained after she had passed. Stephen embarked on a fight against cancer that would have made Beatrix proud. It began by matching dollar for dollar all of the funds McGill University raised towards cancer research. Stephen devoted a portion of every public speaking event to cancer awareness. He even went as far as promoting the death penalty for health professionals who pushed fake or fraudulent treatments. His personal war against cancer never ceased. Stephen tried to keep his sadness from the public eye. He kept up appearances despite publishing no books that year. This only had happened one other time throughout his life, during World War I, when he didn't publish a book. Though he did write again, many Leacock scholars have remarked that his humor had changed. Though he strived for his usual rigor, many reflected that Stephen was more nostalgic and try-hard than he had ever been before. Though he never wrote about his wife or her death, there were excerpts from stories that may display insight to his feelings about her passing. Written within a story in the novel published after his death, Leacock wrote, "The real adoring husband overtalks his wife, overdominates her, pays with unexpected presents for easy forgiveness of his ill temper, and never knows that he adored her till it's too late, because now she cannot hear it." That was from Last Leaves in 1945. Stephen Leacock never remarried. This photograph shows Beatrix posing in her most treasured room in the first house that was built on the property. She's surrounded by her favorite flowers, which were red geraniums. Beatrix was one of the main reasons why the 1928 home that stands on the property today was even built. They had began to make plans for the home in the early 1920s at Beatrix's request, but the house was not finished being built until 1928, 3 years after Beatrix passed. Even though she had passed, Stephen had a sunroom built within the new structure and ensured it was always stocked full of geraniums. To this day, the staff at the museum ensure that the sunroom and the hanging baskets and planters are always stocked with fresh red geraniums, as Beatrix's favorite were the red variety. The photo on the left is of Beatrix in her favorite place in 1925, the same year that she passed away. The photos on the right are of Stephen in his 70s enjoying writing in the sunroom in the current house. These were actually taken by Yusuf Karsh, who was famous for taking photos of many other famous people, pretty much everyone that you can imagine: Audrey Hepburn, the royal family, Ernest Hemingway, Einstein, and Winston Churchill. Reporters could never agree on a description of what Leacock looked like, and many different assumptions had been made over his career. Leacock was described as having a bear-like appearance. He was also described as having kind eyes, disheveled, disorganized. He was described as being energetic and boisterous. However, Leacock was never described as sentimental or romantic. He never wrote about his relationship, and when he wrote about love, it was often in a joking manner, as he wrote humor after all. In the 1990s, the Leacock Museum was undergoing some restoration work in Stephen Leacock's bedroom closet. When removing some trim on a wall, contractors discovered a secret compartment with hinges which contained a series of letters. At first, no one knew why these were hidden in Leacock's closet. Upon reading the letters, curatorial staff realized that these were the last notes sent from Beatrix to Stephen before her death. When Beatrix began to feel ill in early 1925, Leacock was still teaching at McGill and offered to have her and their son Stevie travel to somewhere warm. They decided on the Bahamas, and off they traveled. These letters were sent as often as possible from the Bahamas to Leacock in Montreal. They speak about ordinary daily subjects, but some items stand out. For example, this letter, written on January 27th, 1925, to Stephen, starts off with Beatrix expressing her well wishes for Stephen's recent dinner party. It also humorously shows Beatrix's disdain for some of the people that she is surrounded with while in Nassau. She explains that she has been blamed for not feeding Stevie Jr. enough good food, causing his illness. She says, "Do you remember the Eilers picnic when there was only lobster salad, lemon pie, and fish buns? Stevie had 2 mouthfuls of the salad, so they seem to have formed the idea that this illness is all my fault. And I really think that they believe that I feed Stevie elaborate salads of fat pork, coffee, chocolates, fried potatoes, etc., etc." So she was pretty spunky. On the left, the letter from February 22nd, 1925, Beatrix expresses her want to be home with Stephen. She writes, "I had dinner with McLaughlins and we went for a lovely drive through the pine woods. Simply lovely, but I am kicking my heels to get home. Only I can't do it too soon." The letter on the right says, this letter shows Beatrix's feisty side. She says, "You know how long I take to make up my mind, and now that you aren't here, I can have the luxury of taking all the time I like to make up my own mind and changing it as often as I like." She even had Stevie write his father notes. I love how he always signed them, "Your effect, Stevie." And then when Leacock was writing him something back, he would say, "Your effect, father." One of the reasons for this talk, and one of the things I discovered while researching this topic, is that people are not always who they put forth into the world or who they portray themselves to be. Writers are not their published books. They do not stay the exact same throughout their lives, collecting dust on a shelf. They're more complicated than that. And sometimes there's a backstory that goes unnoticed, or a person helping to shape the story that hasn't been given credit. And so I hope you learned something new throughout this talk about Stephen or Beatrix, or maybe about Agnes or Barbara. So the museum today is open, obviously. Most of the rooms within the house have been kept as close to their original state as they could be. Many of the pieces in the house were the family's personal items and treasures. The boathouse houses an assortment of Leacock's fishing and boating treasures, as well as including pieces from his sailboat, which he named the Selwyn. We also have temporary and permanent special exhibits throughout the house, and we change them up. We usually do about three exhibits a year. These are super fun because, along with studying other members of the Leacock family, through these exhibits, our special place in the museum world is realized. We're a house that was built in the 1920s up in cottage country. We are also the home of an author. So using the time period and the situation in which the house came to be, we can explore topics that help build the story out even more. For example, we have a Leacock-centered exhibit coming up this summer about Leacock's green thumb. It talks about a very special piece of fruit that Leacock loved to eat, but that people actually thought was extinct until we found out that he was growing it in his garden all along. We also have a new exhibit coming up in October called Monster, She Wrote, and it's all about female horror writers throughout the ages. Includes stories that were very famous, like Frankenstein, but also stories that have been forgotten over time, but were extremely influential to the genre as we know it today. We also, of course, have our How We Kept Mother's Day mini exhibit up. So if you were interested in Agnes's story, please come and check that out. It was in the room where Agnes would stay when she stayed in the house. And we have our current exhibit on right now until October. It's called From War to Wonders, which looks at popular fantasy and children's authors who had some part to play in the World Wars and how this might have impacted their writing. For this, we looked at authors such as J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, A.A. Milne, Rudyard Kipling, and J.M. Barrie, as well as Leacock himself. We show artifacts from the Aurelia Legion and local collectors throughout the exhibit, and we have lots of little activities that help guests to understand inspiration and how it can take hold even in the darkest of times. We also have lots of programming going on at the museum, including different tours. Right now, we are doing our Leacock Museum's House and Ground History Tours, which is the entire picture of what happened at the house. It also travels to the boathouse. So if you're interested, please check out our website, leacockmuseum.ca, to book your tour. And we have our very popular ghost walks coming up in October as well. And of course, we have our Leacock Love Story Valentine's Day tour every February. So if you'd like to see some of the areas that I spoke about in the house, this is definitely the tour for you. You will see the closet that Leacock hid the letters in, alongside the sunroom, and many different additional information than what I've shared today. So please visit our website, leacockmuseum.ca, or our social media at Leacock Museum. Keep that updated a lot. And thank you so much for listening to this talk. I really appreciate it. This is a topic that's pretty close to my heart, so I appreciate everyone being here. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. If anyone has any questions, feel free to write them in the chat or in the Q&A function. I actually had a quick question for you. Do you know where the Leacocks stayed in the Bahamas?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Yeah.
I know it was in Nassau. Yeah.
I know there's like a gated community where a lot of like wealthy people from the West stayed. It was called Lyford Key. And I was recently there during COVID, and it made me think of that because I know there was like another Canadian like gold miner from the same period that stayed there as well. So I didn't know if you perhaps knew.
That's so interesting. I don't know exactly at the moment, but I definitely am going to look that up now because that would be really cool.
Like, if it was there, that place has a very cool history as well, and the people that have lived there and that still live there today, very like 0.1% tourists.
Oh wow, I love that's so fun. I wonder if she had something to do with that. I'll definitely look at that.
Okay, so we have some questions. How do I get tickets to the guided tours and other events?
Definitely. So you can go on our website, leacockmuseum.ca, and just click on, if you're interested in the exhibits, just click exhibits. If you're interested in our tours, then it would be in our programming and events section. Just click on it and it'll pop up another area where you just type in all your information and you'll have tickets.
Another question is, do you know what happened to Stevie Jr. over the years?
Yeah, so it's something that we're looking more into over time about exactly what happened with him. But I did hear that he studied actually at the University of Toronto in languages. And so he kind of followed his father's footsteps there. He did do a lot of writing that we have in our collection. And then he did pass away in 1974 at the age of 59.
Does the museum have any more plans to do tea parties?
Yeah, we actually do. So we're planning hopefully to do some in the fall. So if you want to keep updated on that, we'll definitely be posting it on our social media and on our website. So check that out for sure. They're really fun. So I definitely recommend them.
Another question is, did you say Stephen Leacock knew the Pallet family?
The Pellet family. Yeah.
So can you say some more?
Yeah, of course. So Beatrix was actually part of the Pellet family. She was the niece of Sir Henry Pellet, who built Casa Loma. So as I said, she was kind of used to the finer things in life. But if you know the Casa Loma history, you might know that Sir Henry Pellet did squander away a lot of the family fortune on Casa Loma. So by the time that it got down to Beatrix, there wasn't a lot of family money left over for her. So her and Stephen had a kind of a similar history in that way.
Was there ever a definitive diagnosis of Stevie Jr.'s ailment?
That's a good question. And one that I don't know the exact answer to. But if anyone does have any questions that I couldn't answer today, if you wanted to shoot me an email at, my email is amarino@aurelia.ca. So AMARINO@aurelia.ca. And I could definitely be looking into those for you.
I'm just waiting on some more questions. I have another one. Who is your favorite character in the Leacock family?
That is a really good question. It's so easy to love Leacock himself just because of his humor, and I'm just constantly reading his books. So you get to know so much about him. But throughout this research, Beatrix is my favorite character. And I think because when I first started at the museum, I was kind of looking for information on her and it was kind of sparse. So kind of going and digging into things, and you just kind of feel a connection to her over time, just because you're like, oh, I've learned something new, and here's another thing. And then reading her actual letters, it really shows you just how perfect of a match she was with Leacock. As I mentioned, she was hilarious. The things that she would write in her letters, you're just kind of like, she would talk about the people she was staying with, and she'd talk about how she didn't like them, or it's too hot in the Bahamas, and but then she'd turn around and in the same letter she would be just so sentimental, and she would confide in Leacock from so far away through these letters, and so you do get a kind of an idea of her personality.
Oh, Bev is saying we entertained Stevie Jr. at our home many times. He gave me my first dog at his island retreat on Rice Lake near Peterborough. The Barbara in the video is that Barbara Nemo. If you would like to talk about Stevie Jr., we may have some info. I believe his condition was caused by a lack of growth hormone.
Yes, it was, definitely was. That's amazing. That's so exciting. I would definitely love to talk to you. If you did want to send me an email, I'd love to chat. That's something I really love about this job, is that I keep meeting people from the Leacock world that I just keep meeting people. Like I've met the grandson, I believe, of one of the architects that built the house. I've met just like sons and daughters or nieces of different staff members that worked at the house. And so through this, I've been able to start planning future exhibits. So in the future, we'll definitely be doing an exhibit on Stevie Jr. Probably in the next few years, along with the staff at the museum.
Are there details of Beatrix's acting career available, like where she studied in the American cities you mentioned and plays she was in?
Definitely. I know that I talk about it a lot more on the actual tour, so I don't want to give away too much about it. But and I don't actually remember it on the top of my head. Sorry. But that's a very good question.
Don't see any more questions coming. We'll give it a minute.
No problem. And I did see someone mention celiac disease, which is kind of funny because I have celiac disease. So possibly.
So how many letters total were found during this renovation?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think it was around 30 letters, actually. And it's really interesting because someone actually transcribed them all. So when we do tours, we lay out the favorites of them. And then we do have the transcription, so you can read word for word what she wrote. And also something else with the letters that I forgot to mention in the talk is that most of them are actually written in pencil. And next year, they'll be exactly 100 years old, and they've held up amazing. If you saw the slide with the envelopes or any of the slides with the letters, you'll see that they're the pencil writing is still so perfect. So I just find that amazing, and it really shows the proper storage does for these artifacts.
Just going back, I missed a question. Any romantic phrases that you can recall?
That's a good one. I know she talked about wanting to come home to him all the time, pretty much in I'd say about 40% of the letters. She talks about wanting to be home, not wanting to be in Nassau. She talks about not feeling well. And so in those little sections, they definitely seem more personal.
Another same woman says Leacock is my great uncle.
Thank you for being here.
A lot of people going on about scenarios in the chat, but interesting story, but not about Stephen Leacock.
That's okay.
Don't seem to be getting any more.
No problem.
Any. Okay, well, if no one has any more questions, I might hand it back over to Trish. All right, take it away, Trish.
Okay, thanks so much. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. The OMAH-History Committee is grateful for your ongoing support of the OMAH Speaker Series, not only via this Zoom format, but also visiting our OMAH YouTube site, where you can find all the Speaker Series presentations for your viewing. And I want to say a special thank you to Amanda for sharing with us tonight the delightful Leacock Love Story. It's always fascinating to hear stories of Stephen Leacock's life, especially his relationship with Aurelia and his lovely home at Brewery Bay. And it was especially delightful to hear you speak on the special, very heartwarming love story between Stephen and his wife, Beatrix. And as Hannah mentioned earlier, you were interviewed by the CBC Radio on this very topic recently. And it's very exciting to see this story in the Leacock Museum and his legacy receive further exposure to a broader audience in Canada. So congrats, that's really exciting to hear. So thanks again.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Oh, our pleasure. Thank you so much. As Hannah mentioned in her introduction, the speaker series will be on a summer hiatus over July and August. As chair, I thank the OMAH History Committee for their continued commitment in identifying and booking great speakers. As we discuss potential speakers at our meetings, we refer to the topics many of you have expressed interest in through your survey responses, those surveys that go out soon after these talks. We have been working diligently in finalizing our 2025 calendar, and believe it or not, we're also looking towards 2026. Our committee is passionate about preserving our local history and sharing this all with you. So we'll meet again on September 18th when Dr. Chris Decker presents a history of the Aurelia Opera House. The Aurelia Opera House has been a focal point for the cultural life of our community since 1895. It's been described as a magical piece of heritage rich with culture. It has quite the history, so don't forget to register on the OMAH website to learn more about this iconic landmark. And note, in the next OMAH e-Muse newsletter, I think it's June 20th, there will be an article on the Aurelia Silver Band. I've had the pleasure of working with Cliff Whitfield this past year, researching and writing articles on the history of band music in Aurelia, featuring three prominent bands of over the past 100 years: the Aurelia Citizens Band, which became the Aurelia Kelty Band in 1924. And then this third article coming up, the Aurelia Silver Band, which was founded in 1949 by Harry Peacock, and that has provided community-based British-style brass band music for over 70 years. These articles, along with other local history articles written by the committee, can also be found on the OMAH website. Lots of local history to look into with our YouTube videos on the speaker series and our history articles. So please take a look. And so have a wonderful, safe summer, and we'll see you in September. Thanks. Take care.